Chapter 5 is about conflict resolution. And all you have to do is look in your own family, or if you have interned or worked previously, you have seen conflict. I mean, conflict is all around us. Right now, you're seeing conflict in the Obama administration. And I would like you to think of the Obama administration as you look at conflict and also the crisis chapter. We'll come back to it. Because they are perfect examples of people who were not prepared for unfortunate situations that have happened to them. The learning objectives for this chapter are differentiate psychological conflict from social conflict. These are basically the two types of conflict that actually exist in most situations. Understand the levels of conflict that can develop in an organization, and there are many. Describe the different conflict management styles. Describe 3 weapons of influence used in persuasive psychology. If you have taken a psychology course, a basic psychology course can be very helpful to you in learning to deal with people that you manage in an organization. Understand the different ways to negotiate conflict. And some of these are pretty much, when you're in a corporate world, are designated by laws. And then follow the 8 steps to successful resolution. And these 8 steps can be very helpful to you in all parts of your life. Conflict has 2 levels: psychological, the within, and the social, the without. There's 3 levels of managerial communication within these 2 levels of conflict. One is the interpersonal, what goes on inside of you. One is the interpersonal, which goes on with other people, and basically normally 2 people. And then there's the group communication with a large number of people. When there's conflict, a manager has a choice of many things that they can do. And one of the things I want you to think about is either situations in your own company where there's been conflict, or you can go to the Obama administration and all the conflicts they have had over the last 5 years, and particularly currently, and how they have been handled. Because there is basically a lot of problems currently because of their choices of handling. So one of the choices a manager can make, he can avoid blame by blaming somebody else. Place blame on another person, another organization. Holder has been very good about doing this because he never knows anything. He always says, I don't know. And after a while, this becomes not acceptable. Self-oriented or other-oriented. Are you only interested in your side, or are you truly interested in a win-win situation? Are you trying to change the other party? Are you trying to negotiate persuasively so the other party will come over to your side? And then negotiating an acceptable agreement generally means some give and take on both sides. So there's lots of options available when there's a conflict. And the players are very important because their personalities are going to come out very strongly. If you look at the levels of conflict and levels of managerial communication solutions, you've got the conflict up at the top, which we talked about, and it's what is making a decision that has to be made. Now that can come from 2 sources. It can come from something within the individual, or it can come from something social that happened. Now within the individual can also be that individual's ethics as it does not agree with the company's ethics. And you can have an attractive and an unattractive decision that you have to make with both psychological and social. An attractive could be that you have 3 ideal candidates that are coming in for interviews, but you only have 1 position available. The unattractive side of that is management has to decide which 2 people they're going to let go of the 3 ideal candidates. Now, a social conflict could be a pool of funds is made available for annual merit, and 3 managers have to make a decision on how to distribute this pool of funds. The unattractive part of it is 2 senior members are in disagreement on selling company assets where this pool of money is going to come from. So you can have many sides to any issue. And basically what you've got to do is get everybody to sit down and listen to each other and then come up with a meaningful solution. As already stated, there are different conflict management styles. The 3 levels of conflict is within the individual, between 2 people, or a larger group. Sometimes conflict is due to language. Remember we said there's 18 varieties of language as far as English that are spoken in the world. So you can have just meaning differences within a same language. This happens with Chinese, it happens with Spanish, it happens with all the major languages in the world, because there are many different ways of speaking each of those languages. Then you have power relationships, and some of this has to do with the type of company you're working in. Is it a very autocratic company, or is it a very laissez-faire type of organization? And that's going to have an awful lot to do with power relationships and who you have to go through to get things done. And then you have substantive conflict. And substantive conflict is basically over the issues. And these are issues that are being disagreed about. So when these happen, what you have to do is sit down and figure out where are the disagreements, and then how do you solve those. You may have a substantive conflict because you're coming out with a new product, but you don't really have the production capacity for it. So do you go overseas or do you produce in the United States? And there could be lots of disagreements and lots of whys you should do each one. There is no one answer. And then you have procedural conflict, and this is simply how you go about doing something, such as vacation. How do you decide who gets to do vacation first? Now, some of the styles for conflict management are the avoidance, the distributive, and the integrative. And basically, it's important to know something about the people you are working with, because the more you know about these people, the more you're going to know how they think. There are people that will avoid anything that has a negative relationship to it. They just don't want to deal with having to make anybody upset or anybody perhaps not happy. They want to keep everyone happy. Then you have the distributive style, where basically they want to distribute the problem and have everybody come back to them. And what they do on this is people will come up with a lot of different ideas, hopefully, so then you have something to discuss as you come together. And it's not a bad way of managing conflict. And then you have the integrative. And with the integrative, what they actually want is for everybody to sit down and to somehow come up with an idea or a solution that will bring everybody's ideas into it, so that it's a very happy, clappy sort of decision. The style of the person in charge is very important. Everything kind of rolls downhill. As I suggested in a previous chapter, when you have someone at the top who is very positive and very happy, the whole staff becomes that way. Everybody picks up and runs with what they see. So if you want your people to embrace conflict and to come up with a way of handling it, you have to mirror for them what you want them to do. There is a significant relationship between conflict style and decision-making effectiveness. The more people or leaders have a conflict style that makes people feel welcome to offer suggestions, the more open that relationship is, generally the more positive the conflict resolution is going to be. Another thing about teams. Teams are better facilitators of ideas than they are observers. So when you have a team, one of the things you are automatically doing is you are opening up people to discuss. It's going to become more integrative in its style. Now, some management styles. There's the bureaucratic style, which is theory X. where basically everything is done according to roles and procedures, and there's only one way. It's a very black and white type of thinking. Then you have the political model, where conflict is inevitable and normal. And you have kind of a political situation between administrative parts of a company and a union, or the workers, many times, if there is a worker. Then you have the collegial model, where basically conflict is something that's going to be abnormal, and it's something to be eliminated when it happens. So everybody wants to get along, and they'll basically try and make things happen on an ongoing basis rather than having to sit down with a huge problem. And then there's the anarchical model, which happens when resources become scarce. Basically, when you have a bad year, we've had a number of recessions here in recent years, and people have had to be laid off. Companies have had to take production overseas in order to be competitive, and these are very negative situations and can have a long-lasting effect on a company, particularly if the leaders don't try somehow to pull people that are left back together afterwards. Because people will wonder in these kind of situations who's going to be next. It's a very natural thing that tends to happen. And it takes a lot of work to make these downsizings come off positively. Then you have cultural distance. And this happens when your receiver and your senders are very different culturally. They could be from different sides of the world. And when this happens, you've got other problems that you have to look at, because basically a global mindset is one where you're prepared to work with people from different countries, cultures, and contexts. And when this is done virtually, when you never actually see these people in person, this is not an easy thing to make happen. You have to learn an awful lot about these people anecdotally, and some of that is going to be using stereotypes. And one of the things you always want to learn about stereotypes is they can be very dangerous. Stereotypes are not necessarily something that you can depend on. When you're working with people, you're working with individuals, and you have to learn those individual styles. The causes of conflict resolution are what gets you into a situation where you need to be in conflict resolution. One is a lack of good relationship. If you do not talk with your people during good times, how are you going to talk to them during periods of having to cut back or when things are negative? So you need to develop those good relationships so that when something does happen, there's trust that's built up there. A lack of awareness of the consequences that conflict can cause. Conflict has gotten to the point, as with the Schwinn example in the book, where it becomes so bad that they actually have to just close down a factory and move and set up somewhere else. That's the extreme way of resolving a conflict. You don't want to get there. It's very expensive, and generally it will probably cause a firm to completely collapse in the end. And then the other one is a lack of communication patterns between the parties. Basically, they have never developed a relationship, so they've never developed a way to communicate with each other when one or the other sees there's problems, and solve those problems before they become major. There are 4 categories of conflict resolution. You can go to the laws, you can negotiate, you can bring in a mediator, or you can bring in an arbitrator. We're going to talk about each one of these separately. Laws are the basically result of conflicts within society. In the United States, we have lots and lots of laws. And we have lots of corporate laws, lots of union laws, lots of employment laws. There are lots of laws. And when you are a manager, you need to be very aware of the ones particularly that apply to a corporation and hiring and firing and personnel decisions. But you also need to know about the laws on where you can dump, where you can't dump, all kinds of production-related materials. But laws are binding on both employees and employers. They are, quote, the law of the land. Legal precedent is also binding, and what legal precedent is the decision of a court. And all courts at that level and below have to basically abide by whatever another court has said. It's only a higher court that can overthrow that precedent. Negotiated contracts are binding. So they are seen as an agreement, a legal agreement between the entities that enter into them. And businesses have lots of different types of contracts. Hiring and firing and other personnel decisions are legally binding. When we get to the employment chapter, you're going to get into all of the EEOC laws that are on the books. Every manager needs to know these backwards and forwards because they really control how people can interact and things they can and cannot do in the employment environment. You can always go to court to determine a winner when it is a law that's in question. However, that's kind of a last resort. Most companies are going to try and negotiate within their company first, then they're going to bring in a mediator, and then an arbitrator. Going to court is very time-consuming and very expensive, so it generally tends to be the last resort. Negotiation is generally done internally. It's kind of where things begin when there are conflicts. And a negotiation is done by upper management, a subordinate, or a manager, depending on where the problem is. And it may go up that ladder if something is not resolved at a lower point. It can use mentors and networks to help bring a solution by bringing people in who maybe can mediate the situation between two people, who has the person would have to have the trust of both people or groups. It's a balance. It's what's good for the corporation and what's good for the employees. So there's going to have to be some give probably on both sides. And it tends to increase employees' focus, performance, staff retention, morale, and profitability. It needs to be done in a way that it's a win-win. It's a win for the corporation and it's a win for the employee in order to be successful. And many times if that cannot be done, then you will find it will go to a higher state, such as arbitrators or courts. And lots of stuff is not allowed by law in the office or in a business. Things like sexual harassment, viewing pornography during business hours. A lot of these things are not allowed. And if it can't be resolved or it isn't basically decided how to handle it, then it may have to go to another level. But generally, most things can be decided within the company. And you're going to have to negotiate things like salaries, who gets more office space, who's going to get a production line and more production if you have too many things going on. But most things in a company are negotiated. It's something you kind of do every day as a manager. You're always negotiating for something. And it needs to have a positive atmosphere and be a win-win situation for everyone if it's going to be successful. Mediation is the next level. And basically, mediators are brought in when the two parties cannot civilly decide and come to a resolution themselves. For some reason, there's such a conflict that the sides are not hearing each other. So you bring in a mediator who both sides basically trust, and the mediator listens to one side and then to the other side, and basically needs to try and come up with a solution that they see as successful for both. And many times this works. With mediation, neither side is required to accept the mediator's advice. However, generally there'll be some give and take through the mediator that ends up working where just negotiations between the people did not work. You're still talking about the same issues. And this is what sometimes doesn't make sense, is that you have to bring in someone from the outside to solve the situation when basically it's the same information you would have talked about internally. However, what has happened in this situation is there's trust broken somewhere. And if you need a mediator, then you also know you've got trust issues, and you need to work on those in the future. Arbitration is the last chance. And an arbitrator's decision is binding. So if an arbitrator is brought in, and they can be assigned by a court before a court will make a decision, or you can bring in an arbitrator on your own. The sides have to agree to honor the decision of the arbitrator. Unlike a court case, these can be done rather quickly. So from that standpoint, it's better than going to court. Generally, if you look historically, employees generally do better with an arbitrator than they do the courts. Courts tend to come more on the company side than on the employee side. An arbitrator basically will issue a comprehensive scheduling order. You know, we're going to take care of this at this point, and it'll follow with this, and it goes right down in an order. There's a whole list of these in your book that you can go through. It's a process. And basically, it's flexible. If both sides will sit down and talk with an arbitrator very honestly. Generally, an arbitrator will limit the amount of time in which you can give them information. And then after that time, they'll go through all the information from both sides that they have, and they will come up with a decision. If you don't like that decision, then you've got to accept it, because your only other choice would be court. And basically, if you've chosen arbitration, a court probably would not hear your case. Case and deal have a list of resolution steps that you can use basically at any of these levels. You can, from basically mediation, arbitration, negotiation. And the first is a physical location. The location should be a place that is neutral. It shouldn't be in the office building if it's between management and employees. It should be at a neutral location. So, and it's also good to have a neutral location and have all phones turned off, because you don't want people interrupted or leaving the meeting. You want them there. You want them focused. There should be an agenda. Exactly what is it that we need to talk about? And someone needs to make a preliminary statement and limit the things that are going to be discussed. Because sometimes people will get into side arguments, and that's the last thing you want. Deliberation and solution of some issues. Basically, when there's no agreement, it's when you're going to have problems. But generally, if there is trust and people take the situation seriously and are persuasive in their arguments, there will be some solutions that people will come up with. Now, the preliminaries to final negotiations, basically you've narrowed everything down. And generally a good thing to do here is things that you know you're going to agree upon, go through those first so that you have lots of positives before you get to the real hard things that you have to solve. Because if you already have lots of agreements, it then becomes easier to get agreements on the things that are very disagreeable. So what you want to do is have people buy in, and you have them buy in by solving the easy things first and moving to the harder ones. Step 6 is going to be harder because basically this is when you're going to get to the difficult problems. But again, you want a win-win situation. A win-lose situation is going to hurt someone, and generally that's going to make for a very bad situation. Then after you finally get all your negotiations, everybody's agreed on both sides, you write up a contract or a confirmation of what these agreements mean so that there is no misunderstanding by anyone on either side what they have agreed to. And then you have to implement it. Both sides have to do whatever is necessary to make this work. And some of the things in negotiation that you want to watch for and some of the things that you probably want to control for is saying things without thinking first, people being arrogant or rude, just being very symbolic in what you're willing to give rather than really thinking it through, and then watching nonverbal cues. And nonverbal cues can be very important in a negotiation situation. The negotiation error list is by no means complete, but these are some common things that people do. If you look at Table 5.1, you will have these also listed with the consequences, whether they're caused by unthinking or being rude or being symbolic or being nonverbal. And some of them are multiple things or can be multiple things. Some have only one place where they come from. But making a negative initial impression, you only get to make an impression once. So you want to be very careful about the impression you come in with. Failing to listen and talking too much. Basically, it needs to be a give and take on both sides. So you do need to listen carefully, and you do need to take turns on talking. Assuming understanding by another culture, very dangerous. Always ask lots of questions to make sure what you are saying is being understood by the other culture, and also that you're understanding what they're saying. Failing to ask important questions, thinking, oh, everybody knows the answer to that. Everything needs to be stated. You don't want anything that can ruin this agreement in the future. Showing discomfort with silence. Silence sometimes is a very important tool when you're negotiating because you kind of need to think through what's already been said before you go any further. Make sure that any words you use are familiar, and slang should be kept to a minimum, and particularly any kind of words that are not going to be known by everyone. Try not to interrupt somebody when they're speaking. Wait your turn. Failing to read the nonverbal cues or reading them incorrectly can also cause you problems. As people are speaking, jot down key points. What seems to be the problem areas? Jot these down so you can think about them when you're not in the meetings. Don't make statements that you know are going to be irritating or contradictory just for their sake. If they're necessary, that's one thing. But if you're just trying to stir the pot, that's not always a good idea. Failing to prepare a list of questions for discussion. This is what you should be doing when you're not in meetings. Be jotting down questions that need to be discussed. Don't be easily distracted. One reason for not allowing phones, iPads, or such in meetings. You want everybody concentrating. You don't want them doing multitask. Failing to start with conditional offers. You should have an idea of some place to start, and it shouldn't be close to what your final willingness is to compromise. You want to leave yourself some room. That's what it's all about, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, is having some room to compromise. And then be careful that you're really listening and hearing what people are saying and not just hearing what you want to hear. And then use good materials. If you're going to distribute something or use something, make sure that it's of the optimum quality and that it's helpful to your situation.